Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I would like to extend a special thanks to our speakers who traveled all the way to Paris to provide us with valuable insights, and that you will see in the roundtables a bit after this keynote speech. So today we will discuss here the stakes and ambitions of the future EU space law. This initiative marks an important moment in European history, reflecting the significant shifts in the space industry and during broader geopolitical dynamics, which are changing rapidly. Europe faces numerous challenges in space, with the war still raging on in Ukraine, with the recent election of Donald Trump as president of the US and an increasing governmental instability in France, Germany, and other European countries, the direction of future geopolitical currents appears now at the same time increasingly uncertain and open. In this situation, space's role should grow. The Russian aggression in Ukraine has underscored the critical role of space in both military and civilian spheres, elevating the importance of space services for European security. The proximity of Elon Musk to the new US president also elevates the political standing of space issues in the global arena today. As the stated role of the European Commission was to become the first geopolitical commission, space developments are poised to play a crucial role in this ambition. As we confront this new era of global competition, the objectives and ambitions of the future EU space law are still to be defined. Why is such a space law necessary? Why now? Why should it, what should it contain? Are some of the questions we will discuss today with our esteemed presenters, setting the stage for this new chapter in European space endeavors. I would like to remind everyone that this seminar is public. It's being filmed and broadcast live on the internet. It will discuss various points of view between industrial, institutional actors and experts in the field, starting with a keynote presentation from Mr. Rodolphe Muñoz. As a lawyer by training, Rodolphe Muñoz has worked for several international organizations, including the World Health Organization, the OSCE, EFTA Surveillance Authority, and taught in different universities such as Bruges, Sciences Po Paris, and the Law University of Strasbourg. For 8 years at the European Commission in DG DEFIS Unit B1, which deals with the secure connectivity and space surveillance, has been and is the head of the sector for the implementation of the space situational awareness component of the space regulation that comprises space surveillance and tracking, space weather, and near-Earth objects. In addition, he oversaw the drafting of the 2022 STM communication, and now is following its implementation, including the development of the EU space law. Mr. Muñoz, thank you for being here today with us, and you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. Really, it's an honor to speak to you. So what I will do is to give you a presentation of more or less 15, 20 minutes. Then if you have questions, it will be with pleasure that I will try to answer to them. So I have to start with a disclaimer. As you know, that the space law is not published. There is no come final, meaning proposal of the Commission. Therefore, if you have some specific questions on the content, I will not be able to answer to you on the specific element, but I will try to give you general elements. So first, what I would like to do is to explain why we have decided to have a space law. Then where it comes from. I mean, we didn't start it last year to say we need a space law. Why we have this idea of a space law, where it's coming from. Then as well to show you how we have consulted member state industry. And finally, I will explain, or I will try to give you the main elements of the space law, gathering all what has been said publicly on the space law. So first, why we decided to have a space law. The first element is linked to the increase of traffic and as well growth of debris. So the safety part is very important for us. These lead really to a congested space, and therefore, as an objective, we would like with the space law to make sure that at the EU level, we have an EU approach regarding safety. Then the second point is really the lack of coherence regarding security and resilience. We consider as well as a problem the need to increase our readiness for threat levels, and therefore the objective is indeed within the space law to have a specific resilient chapter in order to put everybody at the same level. Then you have as well the third driver is really the environmental aspects. There, the objective is not to develop something too detailed, but more to make sure that we will be in the future able to compare the activities in space regarding the environmental obligations. So the idea is to develop a common language, how you can translate environmental obligation within the space sector. And there is really to foster as well the objective is to the readiness of the sector. Once again, to be while being proportionate, because as I insist, the environmental part is a limited part, but as well to be ready to have access to all the funds where you need to have this environmental readiness. And the overall objective is to answer to the driver, which is a fragmented approach, a fragmented market, really. Indeed, we realize that by having different type of legislation within the EU, you have 12 member states with a legislation, you have a lot of member states who are now adopting their legislation or on their way to adopt their legislation. And indeed, you have different approaches regarding this, the way you will treat the aspect related to safety, to resilience, and to environment. Therefore, the idea is to have an internal market approach, really, to make sure that we have a well-functioning internal market, to avoid as well that some company might be more interested to go in some member state where you have less obligations. So really the idea is to avoid the fragmentation. So this is the first element. But of course, so all these drivers, all these problems, and all these solutions are presented in the impact assessment that we have presented to the Impact Assessment Board, and it has been accepted by the Impact Assessment Board. The impact assessment will be presented with a proposal of the Commission, of course. Now, when we decided to talk about this space law, so once again, I insist, I underline the disclaimer, is not yet a proposal of the Commission. Okay, I insist on that. But at least we are consistent. Why? Because in the communication, on the STM communication in 2022, it was announced clearly that one of the elements regarding the regulatory part, you need to have this internal market approach. Then as well, it was underlined by the French conclusion of the Council in May and June 2022, where clearly it was written that, of course, while respecting the competence of the member states, there is a need to develop a regulatory approach regarding the space elements related to safety resilience. You had as well a resolution of the Parliament, which was adopted in October 2022, which clearly stated as well the need to have an EU approach regarding the space law. Then we had the communication on space and defense, SSSD, communication, where we reiterated the fact that we needed a space law. So finally, now we have the letter of intent of our new commissioner, Mr. Kubil, saying that one of the activities that he has to develop is to develop a space law. So this is where we stand today, meaning that we have drafted something and now we had to wait for the official nomination of the commissioner, the nomination of his team, and now we will start discussing with him in order to know what he wants to do exactly, but it's part of his letter of intent. So this is where we stand. I think it's interesting, being in France, to underline that this idea of a need of a space law is as well underlined by the Assemblée nationale, which adopted a specific resolution in March 2024, stating that there is a need, and this is the name is a resolution about the adoption of a European space law. And we had hearing last week with the Senate, because the Senate is preparing as well a specific resolution on this topic. So just to show, it's interesting to see that as well at the national level in France, being in France here, there is really a lot of discussion regarding this point. Now, the question is really what we did. So what we did, we know that, of course, this space law raised a lot of questions, problems, issues, because this will be, should be, will be, I hope will be, the first text which will harmonize the space sector at the EU level. So what we did, we launched a lot of consultations. So once again, we had specific consultations with the member states. We had as well specific consultations with the industry. We had specific workshop with the industry, but as well with the research association, for example, and all the possible entities linked to space. To give you an example, in the space law, we have as well this idea to have a space label. We organize a specific meeting about the space label where we explain what we have in mind, where we invited as well there all the space community in order to discuss about it. So we try to be as transparent as possible. Of course, there are some limits, because as long as you do not have a proposal of the Commission, because the Commission has to decide to have a proposal, this is a decision from the college, and as long as you don't have a decision from the college, you don't have a space law. You have ideas, and I insist on that. So here, what we did as well, we received a lot of papers, position papers from the industry. And this was very interesting. Based on these position papers, we had as well bilateral with the industry in order to discuss these issues. We had what we call as well a targeted consultation with a lot of questions, more than 25 questions to the industry. We received nearly 400 answers, which is for the community a very high number of answers, because some of them are gathered by as well some associations. And then we had bilaterals with some satellite operators. Anybody asking, we had bilaterals. We had as well bilaterals with non-EU actors. They wanted to discuss about this issue, and we were all the time accepting all these meetings. So if you wanted to count all of them, I think we could say that we had more than 100 meetings in total, even more, because some of them were with repeated with member states. Once again, not presenting the content, because this we cannot tell you the content of the law, neither to the industry nor to the member states, but once again, trying to understand what can be done and what cannot be done. Out of the consultations, really, and I will talk about here more what we read regarding the industry, it's always, I will say, a bit scary, because you launch your consultation, you have an idea, of course you have prepared, you have done your homework, you don't launch questions like that, but you try to make it as something feasible, of course. This is the idea. And with all this consultation is to show you that it's not a decision from an obscure civil servant in one office to have a space law. There is really a wish, a need to develop that. Once again, pending the political approval by the college. And here, coming from the industry, it was clearly a please go. We need it, of course, with a lot of caveats, such as proportionality, such as be careful, don't go too far, such as if you do it, you need to impose as well obligations to non-EU, such as, okay, but just to tell you that when you launch this type of consultation, I mean, with a member state, you can always negotiate, I will say, because you try, even if time to time you fail, but you can try to negotiate. With the industry, you get a blank, I mean, without filter answer, which is good, because then you test if you were right or not. And frankly speaking, once again, 99% were positive, with the caveats, of course, that I mentioned to you, which are normal ones. So we have seen why, we have seen where it comes from. So it's now more than 2 years that we are thinking about it, trying to exchange. And of course, with all these exchanges, and it's normal, we adapt our future proposals. I mean, when you have consultation, it's not just to tick the box. Otherwise, you are doomed to fail, because we have changed some elements, obviously, following the discussions that we had, because it could be that some of them went too fast, others not enough, that some of them perhaps were too complex, others, etc., etc. So we really use this opportunity to tailor more our future proposal. Now, what will be inside? And once again, this is what you have seen from the targeted consultation. So this is nothing new that I will develop here for the obvious reasons that I mentioned perhaps already 5 times. So here, the first element is, of course, you have 3 pillars: safety, resilience, environment. Safety, resilience, the main elements, with really some requirements, of course. Then on the side of environment, very limited but needed obligations, more towards developing a common language regarding environmental aspects. Regarding the scope, well, the scope, of course, in order to define the scope, we took into consideration a very important point, which is the competences of the member states. We know our limits. We know that we cannot do whatever we want. You have some obligations, I don't know, about frequencies, about the implementation of the UN conventions, liability. All these elements are member state competence. And obviously, we cannot step in. Then the idea is, of course, to target EU operators. This makes sense. Huh? We don't develop extraterritorial obligation here. We target EU operators with obligations on safety, on resilience, on environmental aspects. And regarding the operator outside the EU, it is only if they target the EU market. If they target the EU market, they need to comply with what they should be, they should have, or I don't know how to put it. Once again, we understand, they shall. This is what we have in mind. Once again, political clearance will come with a decision of the college. I insist on that again. But it makes sense. I mean, this is a clear request from the industry. If we put only obligation for our EU operators, well, we kill basically the entity for which we are doing the law. So this is not, let's say, logical, I will say. Then the other aspect is the fact that you will have some requirements. Some of them will be quite detailed. You will have as well the use of standardization, of course, but you will have as well some soft law measures, such as the labels today. Once again, the idea is to develop, and this has been presented by the Commission extensively, the label issue. So basically, the ideas behind is first, internal market, to have the same requirements for safety resilience. Once again, environment is something special. Second, competitiveness, having in mind these elements. And third as well, to show to the outside world that we have a common approach regarding safety and resilience, that in a way we are implementing as well the long-term sustainability guidance, which has been adopted by the UN, where you have all these obligations for entities to develop these elements. And there I will conclude taking the example of the safety, where in fact you see today that with the Pact for the Future adopted by the UN, there is even a call to have coordination at the international level. Once again, not a legislation, not a treaty, but a coordination at the international level. Therefore, it would be indeed better if the EU could, regarding safety, I take here the example of safety, to agree on what we consider as a necessary requirement regarding safety. Because what is behind this law is, in fact, the possibility for today and for tomorrow to have access to space. I think, and this is why I think industry is really willing to push for this law, is because they know that it's just a matter of time before something happens. I'm in charge of the SSA flagship, and among of them you have the space surveillance and tracking, where we look for collision. This is something which is very hard to sell. We are the Cassandra. We are telling you, this is the end of the world. You will end access to space. And I can say that 7 years ago, perhaps everybody was looking at us like that, really. When you were talking, some people at least were looking at us like that. Now it's really different. Now everybody is conscious that it will come. There is not a chance, there is high probability that you will have a catastrophic event in Leo today. So indeed, we need to work at the EU level, respecting member state competence, I insist on that, taking into consideration the competitiveness of the industry, but we need to agree at the EU level in order to be able to what? Then to be prepared, and as well to be prepared to discuss at the international level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Muñoz. I think we have time for one question because I see that time flies. So if somebody in the room has a question, maybe Ms. Rota, in the front.
Hi, thank you so much, Andrea Rotter from the Seidel Foundation in Germany. I know that you cannot talk about the specific context, but perhaps you can allude about who you talk to. So did you also talk to representatives from the military regarding the dual use nature of space technology and perhaps, you know, granting priority access in case of conflict? Thank you.
Of course, we discuss with military side. We have within the STM communication, the first action is to develop a civil and military STM requirement. That we have done. We had several meetings. We are on the verge to finish the exchange with the civil operators and the military operators. The military operators are, the consultation is headed by EDA. So they are the one in charge. So of course, this element was, we took into consideration, of course, this very important element, with as well the question that you could say that everything is dual as well.
If everybody is willing to sacrifice maybe a few minutes of the coffee break later, we can have another question, if there is one in the room. Okay, maybe Mr. It's coming. The mic is coming.
Thank you. I will address my question to the University College London hat. You mentioned, I quote you, that you were saying that what you can and what you cannot regarding some of the issues of the law. Can you, or are you today able to indicate to us what are the real red lines that you had not addressed or that you cannot address in the space law? This is my first question. And my second question is, in your perception, when do you think the law will be publicly known? Because we heard many times Thierry Breton announcing that the law could maybe be announced by the end of 2023, then it was at Easter 2024, and now we're reading that it might be the first semester of 2025. Where are we regarding this issue? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. The first one is, as I said, everything stemming from the UN treaties. This is a no-go, full stop, and it's normal. There is no discussion about it. Then you have as well the issue related to frequencies. There as well, this is a member state competence. We directly, we don't want to step in there. Then regarding the timing is why I said at the beginning, a disclaimer, the law is ready, but it's up to the political masters to decide when it will be done. Indeed, today is Q1 2025. I don't know if it will be the case. For me, the law is written. It is, of course, not perfect. When you will, if you will, and when you will see it, you can, and this is a collective work, I insist. I was not the only pen, far from that. But this is then after a political decision, and will this political decision happen? This is a decision which has to be taken by my big bosses, so not by me. I really hope that it will be, but if it's not, they probably have reasons not to. But I really think, I really believe in this act, even if it's not an easy one to defend from time to time. I will put it that way.
Thank you very much. I think that's all the time we have, unfortunately. I would like to thank again Mr. Muñoz for his intervention, his keynote speech. We can applaud him maybe once again. Thank you very much. And now for the first roundtable of our event, I will call the first panelist, and I will cede my seat.
then we go directly, and sorry to have deprived you of your pause, or it will come later. Because we want to save time, if you allow me, I will be very short on the presentation, because as far as I know, you have a file and you have the presentation. Then in this panel, we have no institutional limitation, as Mr. Muñoz had and will have for us some time. And then it's very interesting to be able to hear from academics, from people who are in universities or foundations or think tanks, how you see this issue of space law. What is the impact of the space law? Why do we need it? And what are the chances to have it agreed and implemented? Firstly, because of the reaction of the institution, of course, but of the member states, of the different stakeholders, and also of the third states. Perhaps to set the scene, I will give first the floor to Mrs. Dimitra Stefoudi. You are assistant professor in the University of Leiden, and you have several also international positions. Then please, could you give the context? And again, after this very precise and useful presentation of what is on the table, what is prepared on behalf of the Commission, and with the consultation that led to the present state of the file, how do you see the future and the developments ahead of us?
Good morning, bonjour. I think I have a presentation. If we could please pull it up, that would be great. But in the meantime, let me say that the views are my own, and they're also based on informed assumptions, because as was said several times and will be surely said again, I'm not privy to any specific provisions of the EU space law, but I'm hoping to provide a little bit of context, especially on the legal basis of the EU space law, and some thoughts to feed our discussion later. Although there was an expectation, and if we can please go to the next slide, that there will be an EU space law, or at least some sort of framework on behalf of the EU, I believe it did come out of the blue a little bit, especially when it concerned the timelines. Of course, the EU is active in the space field. We know that through the work of DEFIS, the EU Space Agency, the Communication on Space Traffic Management, but it was perhaps a little premature when it came to its announcement in September 2023, at least officially expecting a draft in 2024. The situation now is that the Commissioner designate announced a regulation creating a single market for the space sector in 2025. I'm not sure whether the word regulation was used to specifically describe that it's going to be a regulation instead of a directive. But there is certainly a focus on the internal market. But we are anticipating any development that is going to come in 2025. We know what the legal basis is not going to be, and that is not going to be 189. So if you click one through, we're going to remove that from our screen. As far as the internal market is concerned, how the internal market is translated into the space sector is debatable. It could very well address the supply chain that is not only the industry, the operators of satellites, but anyone involved in the design, operation, launch of a space activity. I find the environmental protection more tangible, specifically because environmental regulation in the EU is very well developed, and it's very useful for the space sector to learn from environmental regulation in other fields. I believe the discussions at the moment are about connecting concepts like the life cycle assessment, that is a very well-known concept in other areas of environmental regulation, to the space sector, which would be very useful for the actors in this field. The pillars are well known. Sustainability, of course, very important. Safety was highlighted by the keynote speaker. When it comes to the third pillar, the terms resilience and security are interchanged. I believe the discussion started with reference to security, then it was shifted to resilience. Now I see in the official text that we're back to security. I think that in this regard, nuances are important because resilience focuses more on creating robust systems, whereas obviously security refers to protecting from security threats. That is just to put a little bit of context and just to share a few opinions. If you could go to the next slide. And here I have quite a bit of animation, so you'll need to click through. Thank you. With everything new, there is always good news, bad news. We always start by the bad news. Some of the challenges, some of the limitations, of course, have to do with the specific competence of the EU, and I find it rather difficult to operate within the confines of Article 189. What could you regulate that will not, in one way or another, conflict with national laws, especially because some EU countries have rather elaborate regimes. That said, there are areas that have not been regulated yet. For example, manufacturing that is used for the space sector, the activities of non-EU operators that are active in the EU. So there are some areas where the EU space law can really bring significant impact. There is an elephant in the room, and that is the goal of the EU space law to remove any uncertainties by creating until the time some policy and legal uncertainties. The first one coming from some lack of clarity and of transparency, but I don't mean this in the negative way because we're discussing about the EU space law, but we do not know what is in there. So there is that. And starting this discussion almost a year ago without knowing already what is in there just perpetuates this unclarity. But I believe that the uncertainty really has to do with any potential conflict with national regimes, given also that of course, the member states are positive for this development, but are planning for 5, 10, 15 years down the line, especially if they have specific strategies for the space sector. And for that, it is important to know sooner rather than later. As far as the timing is concerned, it could be a little bit inopportune, not with regard to the delays, because of course it is a very long process. But first of all, because developments worldwide are rapid, and whatever the EU space law incorporates should be forward-looking, really future-proof. But also because some issues that affect the space sector have already implemented without any guidance that the EU space law would be very useful for. And here I'm referring specifically to cybersecurity, waiting for the implementation of the EU regulations on that, where there was unclarity as to what this means for the space sector. Everyone was looking into the EU space law to provide some answers. The deadlines came and went for the implementation of the Network and Information System Directive and the Critical Entities Resilience Directive. And there, the EU space law could have provided some further clarity because cybersecurity and resilience are fundamental in the space sector. But those are just some maybe drawbacks, not necessarily challenges that the EU space law cannot overcome. And going to the maybe good news, the EU cannot rely on the capabilities of others, and I believe this becomes more and more clear by the day for obvious reasons. And maybe something that is seemingly not redundant, but less important because we have these capabilities elsewhere, perhaps in the private sector, is still very important to invest in. When we're speaking about the IRI² to offer secure connectivity, we're talking about a service that already exists in the commercial market. But it remains very important to have it even as an alternative, let alone as a very elaborate system of services. When we were discussing about the need to have Galileo as a response to the GPS, there was, of course, a discussion that what if the US tomorrow decides to shut down GPS, but there, the idea was mostly what if there is a technical difficulty that does not allow us access to GPS, whereas nowadays, it is as likely as ever that GPS may be shut down or not provided worldwide. Minimum standards are very useful, first of all, to establish a level playing field. And minimum standards is mostly what EU regulations are doing. For countries, in the EU that do not have their national regime developed yet, it would be very useful to have some EU guidance as to what to include there. Some of the issues that we already know are going to be addressed in the EU space law, as was mentioned, is sustainability and space traffic management. But we could perhaps see some further guidance regarding debris, or perhaps some more pressing issues in the international discussions, such as the impact of constellations in the dark and quiet sky. So there are options for the EU space law to create change or lead the way in some areas. No need to mention once again and highlight the importance of security and resilience, but because cybersecurity is extremely relevant nowadays, whatever can provide guidance as to, first of all, what is cybersecurity in the space sector, whether and how we should protect ground-based infrastructure, space-based infrastructure, and how would be very useful. No less because we do rely on space infrastructure for many other applications. And of course, there is a competitive advantage, not only because we want to make the European space sector more competitive generally as a market, but because it's much different to speak about one approach as opposed to 27 member states' approaches. That can also be a competitive advantage for actors, space actors in the EU, if, for example, they comply with labels or they comply with minimum standards and they can promote it as some sort of validation. If we look into the US, there are in certain areas of space activity pre-assessments where if you comply to those, if you comply to cybersecurity pre-assessment, then you can say to your stakeholders that I have a certain level of validation of my services, and you can certainly use that as a private actor to promote your business. That said, between the bad news and the good news, there are some unclear areas. The first one, and I believe it's significant, has to do with the governance of space activities in the EU. Of course, the political mandate remains with the European Commission that is very active, also including with the activities of the EU Agency for the Space Program. But the European Space Agency has been there much, much longer, and it does hold the keys to research and development. I don't know if there are already or will be potential conflicts in the mandate of the two. And we see, of course, many more agencies of the EU involved in the space activity. So it would be good to clarify how governance will be seen after the adoption of the EU space law. I don't see the fragmentation of national laws as a disadvantage, as was mentioned before, because it is really the priorities that every member state sets for their own industry. And if a member state is less active, then they just work with the consequences of their actions, I believe. But it is an ambitious undertaking. Of course, it does take time, but it does also require resources that surely are there. But to work within this perhaps tight timeline, they also need to be well coordinated. Now, to wrap up my discussion, if we go to the last slide, if I could give maybe one reason why we could have space law, is because if you don't set your own rules, you will have to comply with someone else's rules. The ultimate question with any regulation is what problem will it solve? And that, I believe, turns to a policy question. Even if it's not something really important in terms of regulation, because we don't have a gap or something is already there, it works well, then the what problem will it solve may be something more strategy related that will have to do with the autonomy, the sovereign capabilities of the EU in the longer term. With that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to any discussion we have later.
Well, thank you to you. And I propose that the questions will come after the three of you would have spoken. And I will pass directly the floor to Mrs. Andrea Rother, who is in the Hans-Seidel Stiftung in Germany, and also has passed in other German foundation and also more institutional one, international one. And if you would, based on what we just heard, said, what for you are the chances, particularly, of course, seen from a German perspective, and what are the conditions for a success, and how do you see the balance between the obligations that our enterprise will have and the benefit that can come both in terms of protection, but also competitiveness for them?
Thank you so much. Also, thank you so much for the kind invitation. I also have prepared a PowerPoint presentation. Don't worry, since I did not know really about the content, as anybody else here, I've prepared lots of slides, but we'll go through them real quick. So thank you for the kind introduction. It was dated, so compared to Dimitra, I'm not an international law specialist. So I focus on the security and strategic dimension of space in these times, but certainly the plans brought forward by the European Commission certainly fit right into the, this changing security environment and strategic environment. So I was also asked to provide a perspective from Germany, and I think here you could say it's a very interesting time in Germany. Please, next slide. Yes, because at the one side, we could say Germany is a little bit at a disadvantage because contrary to France, for instance, Germany does not have a national space law yet. It was announced in our space strategy in 2023. But as you might have heard, that the coalition collapsed in Berlin, so the fate of the space law is still uncertain, and it will unlikely be passed during this legislative period, but hopefully will enter the coalition agreement. So when I talk about the German position, I think what's quite interesting is that we will have, or that we're having parallel discussions on the national, but also on the European level, which might feed into how German officials, but also how the German industry perceives the EU space law. Perhaps, please, we go to the next slide. When you think about what is currently being discussed in Germany, and there we have a huge parallel to what is being discussed on the European level, we have nearly the same objectives. So first of all, we still need to have a space act, so to speak, to implement our international obligations. We also still do not have the opportunity or the possibility in Germany to seek redress for liability issues with the commercial sector. Of course, and this is the same approach to EU space law, we want to provide certainty for the private sector in Germany and also legal predictability in a sense, and of course also increase our international competitiveness when it comes to our space industry. And this is why I asked the question earlier on, of course, how we can address risks to our public safety in order, and also how our armed forces might be able to draw on services and information provided by the commercial satellite operators, for instance, is one of the key issues that was mentioned in the paper that was published in September 2024, which more or less offered the key points about the German Space Act, which it would likely foresee. When you look at the content, I think it's a very standard content comparable to other European countries. It will talk about the scope of application, the authorization requirements, how the German government might seek redress from the commercial sector in case of accidents or incidents, but also when it comes to monitoring and so on. So perhaps, please, the next slide. When we talk about, and this is also very similar, I think what we see on a European level. So when we talk about the scope, basically of the law, all activities within the European Union and also within and outside Germany. So there might be a point of conflict when it comes to that. should be governed or should be applicable to the Space Act, and also, and this is something that certainly will come up in the European space law, that certain requirements regarding safety, security, and sustainability have to be met by the satellite providers or by the services providers, but which have yet to be defined in more detail. Next slide, please. And this is something perhaps that is very interesting, at least from our governmental and industry point of view. So we have the German Space Act, as it is proposed now, has limited the liability or the capability to redress in case of incidents to 10% of the operator's average of the last 3 years, but no more than 50 million. So in this regard, and this is, I think, one of the few things that was considered positive by the German industry, that the liability was reduced or was limited to 50 million in this way. Next slide, please. And this is something which is considered particularly tricky from our German industry point of view, that in the key paper and the key points paper that was issued by the federal government, there was or is the opportunity provided for the German armed forces for defense purposes under very strict conditions, I have to add, to ask for the prioritization of data and of services for defense purposes, and the same applies for civil protection and security authorities in the case that a public emergency is determined by the federal government. So this is something that, especially from a German industry point of view, doubts were raised about whether this could harm the German industry or not. So next slide, please. So, and I think this is something that we will see is very similar to the debate we'll be having about the European space law in Germany, that we have a lot of open questions in this regard, challenges, but also criticisms. So when the key paper was issued, there was a survey by the Federation of the German Industries, which, as you can see, was more or less negative with regards to this National Space Act, especially among startups and small and medium enterprises in this regard. And here, of course, and this is something that will be also seen on the European stage, we have the fear that additional costs and bureaucratic hurdles will be imposed. We have yet to see special provisions for SMEs and startups. There's the fear that we might have a duplication of processes when it comes to licensing our space activities. And one of the main critique points was also that there is no, at least in the few things that we know about the EU, about the German Space Act, no differentiation between the different, let's say, the scope of the activities, and also with regard to their threat potential when it comes to safety, resilience, and sustainability. So all in all, you can see that we are in Germany right now at the process of defining our own space law. But this, of course, also draws parallels to the discussion we will have with regard to European space law. Next slide, please. Talking about the EU space law, and a lot of things have been mentioned, so I just want to pick out a few things. I think that where also the challenges, but also the objectives of the EU space law might lie. First of all, I think the idea of establishing a level playing field apart from the standard issue is one of the main opportunities that the EU space law might entail. I also think that, and since I do research on the geopolitical rivalries in space, which more and more also in this geopolitical climate talks about the role of technological leadership and norms and standard setting, I think here the EU space law does also show the attempt of demonstrating European leadership when it comes to technological standards, but also when it comes to norm and standard setting ability, to the norm and standard setting ability, which we have seen in so many other fields by now. We have already talked about the scope, so we could go to the next slide, please. Perhaps when we talk about the 3 pillars, one thing that has not been mentioned yet, but what I find very critical in this regard is when we talk about the resilience of our space system, that we take a whole of production process so that we do not just think about how to secure and harden our space infrastructure and how to protect them, but think of the whole process in terms of thinking about the production process, but certainly also about critical supply chains. And I think this is something that really should be mentioned in the EU space law, and probably will. And also with regard to sustainability, but also with regard to resilience, I think the EU space law really offers the opportunity to increase the information sharing and data sharing when it comes to incidents, but also when it comes to best practices, which might be difficult for the industries to comply with, because nobody really is keen on publishing in a way or giving out too much information in the industry or in the commercial sector. But I think here we will see hopefully an incentive to provide more information. Next slide. Next slide, please, because this had not been mentioned, but we can talk about that during the discussion. So when we talk about open questions, challenges, and criticisms, and here we see a parallel when it comes to the German national debate and the EU debate. Of course, adding additional costs and bureaucracy, especially for a very cost-sensitive but a technology-driven sector, is always something that the private sector will be not hard to persuade to, because when you look at especially safety and resilience issues, I think, as Mr. Muñoz has mentioned, there is a keen interest in setting standards and creating an even playing field. Similar to the German debate, I think on a European context, it will be interesting to see whether there will be a differentiation in kind of putting priorities when it comes to the 3 pillars, but also with regard to the scope of the activities and the potential for risks. So not, accounting or not describing, or having the same process for every kind of space activity. We will be interested in this also, of course, from a German point of view, to see whether or to what extent there is a differentiated approach for small, medium enterprises and startups. Also the process of implementation, the design and impact of the incentives. So if we have non-binding incentives, how are they designed? Especially voices in Germany are pretty skeptical about that. I think when it comes to regulatory power, we'll have to be prepared to mitigate potential negative repercussions that we have also seen in other fields when it comes to that. Overall, of course, the EU space law probably will not be enough to strengthen European space industry. There will be more, especially with regard to money and the finances, to really achieve this goal. Dimitra has talked about the EU competences and where there might be problems. And the last thing I really want to stress is with regard to the regulatory power. So from a strategic point of view, it's one of the things for the European Union that is hard that is hard to bring together is, on the one side, of course, the regulatory power and the attractiveness of the European internal market, while at the same time lacking the capabilities when it comes to, having the hard power in a way. We've seen that in other technological fields when it comes to artificial intelligence, for instance, that of course you can have the regulatory power, but it's always difficult in a way to you know, to impose the regulatory power if you do not have the hard power to back it up with. And with that, I'd end my short presentation and hand it over to Madame Arnould. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very clear presentation of, well, of issues, problems, criticism, and both at national level, ongoing process for you, and at the same situation in a way, and at the EU level. Then I give now the floor to Mrs. Maria Vittoria Massarin, and coming from the Istituto Affari Internazionali. I don't speak Italian, and it's difficult for me to pronounce, and to present also both the Italian position, but also the way you see the reaction around not only Italy, but in the EU. And I think it will come afterwards with the questions, but what will be the reaction from outside the EU, and what will be the interaction with the other actors, particularly the American actor?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm particularly happy to be here with such an experienced panel of women. Let me underline that. Yeah, I'll try to give you an idea of where Italy is, and also try and answer Madame Arnauld's question. I do have slides as well, yes. So what I will touch upon is in the next slide. So as you might have heard, or if you haven't, you'll hear it now, Italy's working on a space law, has worked on a space law, is in the process of approving it. And then I will briefly touch upon potential implications for Italy, but generally speaking for the whole sector. And then I also found it interesting to read a bit, or again, rather, the European Union space strategy for security and defense, and kind of put it into perspective with what's been put in the Italian national space law. And then a bit of a focus on the space industry's role. If we go to the next slide, reading the 31 articles of the Italian space law, of course it's in Italian, so it's not extremely accessible, but one point I would like to underline is that Italian processes take a long time, and it's currently being approved. It was approved, it being adopted in the process of. It was approved by the Council of Ministers, so it could still see some edits here and there. And we'll get to that more when we get to the industry, because the industry had a lot to say about some of the provisions. But these are 4 of the key points that are in the national space law. So I'll go through them super quickly. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. But what the Italian space law aims to do is, of course, to regulate and define some objectives for the space sector. By accountability, that's the best term I could come up with, to not write liability and responsibility. But we also did something in that regard. Some core requirements for the sector, especially for private companies. Now, this is something I would like to focus a bit more on, because the core requirements affect the industry more than anything, especially because, as you might know or might have heard, the Italian space sector is very fragmented in terms of who does what and who's responsible for what, for roles, and in a way we could say it's as dual use as space, because lots of entities and lots of institutions do double the things, let's say. So I found it particularly important that the new Italian space law designated the Italian Space Agency to authorize and supervise operations and activities in space. And not only that, but going back to the requirements, it postulates that private entities have to have an insurance policy of up to 100 million euros. And that has to happen before the space activity, which is incredibly important, especially if we put it into perspective with European space law. Because as we said, and as my colleagues said, that perfectly, I think, goes within the framework of trying to enhance safety, security, resilience, sustainability as well. And I think that's very important, especially in light of STM, SSA, so to have that kind of support. And on top of that, the Italian institutions also thought about the difference between big companies and SMEs. So for big companies, the cap is 100 millions. For SMEs, it's 20 millions. So that's particularly relevant because as researchers, we were a bit worried that would have been overlooked. So the status of SMEs, we have a lot of them on our territory, and it was important to safeguard them in the best way. And I cannot say whether that's the best way, but in looking at all the ways that could have been chosen, I think that's a good way for sure. Economic support mechanisms. This is probably another core requirement, but I wanted to give it its own space because the Italian space law does something that's very important, in my opinion. It establishes a space economy fund, and it also establishes a national plan for space economy. So the national plan for space economy is supposed to be a 5-year plan, which evaluates and analyzes the different prospects on the territory. While the fund is multi-annual and is aimed at promoting space activities and also the development of the space sector. So kind of like tracing all the activities, which is very important because they're, again, extremely fragmented. Next slide, please. Here, I won't repeat what has been said, so I'll try my best to be innovative, but I try to reflect a bit on what could be the opportunities, challenges, what the status is with regards to European space law and its implications for Italy, but I think these are valid for the broader space sector as well. Some of them come straightly from talking to industry and stakeholders, and some of them are just brainstorming with my colleagues back in Rome. So as regards with the alignment, I think that the European space law is a good opportunity to reduce fragmentation and harmonize the sector. The opportunities are undeniable and they've already been very well analyzed. The challenges, and forgive me if I spend a bit more time on those, but they're, as we said, we focus on the bad first and then we go to the good. The challenges are gonna be balancing regulatory alignment and adaptations, and also addressing increased competition because the European space sector is broad, and granted there's lots of funds available, but what the European space law, in my opinion, is going to have to be good at doing is not to increase the competition, but just promote cooperation. Because we often see in European Defence Fund projects or European Defence Agency projects that companies do collaborate, but also tend to be very competitive and very protective of their own knowledge and know-how. So I think one potential role of the European space law could be that. My personal reflection, again, these are all personal reflections, sorry, I forgot to say that, as Dimitra said, but my personal reflection connected to the Italian space law is that the fund, the Space Economy Fund that I just mentioned, could be integrated with European funds, with public and private partnerships, which could be an opportunity as well. Next slide, please. Here I'm gonna boast a bit about our national space law, because each of these clouds that you see here is almost perfectly reflected into our law. So for instance, if we go to sustainability initiatives, debris mitigation, not only that, but there's a particular attention to sustainability in the law, which translates into a mandatory analysis of kind of like the footprint of space activities, which I found to be not innovative because it's been talked about, but I didn't expect it to be included in there. So it was a nice addition. As for resilience, of course, the European Space Strategy for Security and Defense stressed that a lot. And again, I think some of the articles and provisions in the national space law in Italy are aimed towards that. In a more practical sense, with the Italian Space Agency being the grantor for activities, there's also more strength to space activities. And if we quickly jump to space safety measures, the law, much like the strategy, supports collision avoidance measures with also background analysis before the activity, and also promotion of international data sharing protocols and promotion of encryption of data, which again kind of well depicts the changes that are happening at the European level with cybersecurity measures and kind of like implementing directives and regulations. If we go to the next slide, and I promise you, just checked, it's the last one. So space industry's broader role in the transition. One thing that I forgot to mention is that much like the EU and much like it was mentioned by our keynote speaker, the authorization for activities regards activities in Italy, but also done by Italian operators outside of Italy. So we do not regulate or try or attempt to regulate foreign activities. So to answer your question, I think there's opportunities for the European space law to kind of open itself up, open Europe up to more collaboration and more institutionalized cooperations. And of course, as I stressed already, expansion into new markets or even old markets, but in a better and more institutionalized way for also SMEs and startups. The challenges, again, I'm going to repeat myself, are regulatory and operational as regards to the costs, because it doesn't have to limit European actors' ability to move within the market. And also, we have to try and avoid an increase in the competition, which is already, in my opinion, quite high. I'll stop here and we'll be happy to discuss anything further.
Thank you very much. We have nearly half an hour for question. I will less. No, 15 minutes for questions. I will nevertheless take the privilege to ask perhaps the first question. Well, we already have at national level or are in the process of having at national level and at the European level measures which are thoroughly, cautiously, wisely prepared and hopefully implemented. At the same time, we have a new American administration. And there is the administration, and I didn't perfectly understand whether he was in the administration or near the administration, but Mr. Musk. And how do you see, vis-à-vis these processes, the impact of the predictable or unpredictable American position, knowing that in space and particularly in low orbiter, it's, well, the challenge to say the least, or the possible disaster, as Mr. Muñoz mentioned, could happen. And what will be, how prepared are we, or how could we be prepared to a big shock, even bigger than scheduled, with the profile of the new powerful people in Washington?
Yeah. I'll quickly start. That's a worry I partially share, in the sense that it is a new administration, but it's also kind of old in a way, because we've seen Trump already, and it's lots of the things he's done are debatable, in my opinion, and also lots of the things he's done so far in the new administration are debatable. But the US's space policy stems from his administration. So it's undeniable that space, I think, will have a prominent role. I think it's Musk that makes it a bit tricky here, because when it's only one person that that's unpredictable, then it's a bit easier to kind of limit the scope of action. When it's two together, it's a bit trickier. And if we want to touch upon just one point, I'll go to what Dimitra said earlier. It might become a problem for dark and quiet skies, because I do see maybe an increase in constellations being launched and being authorized to just operate with no particular like control. And that could create a problem, especially because in Europe, we're working well towards maintaining dark and quiet skies. And I am also a bit worried about war theaters in terms of how the support of Starlink and Musk might be shaped in with regards to what Trump might decide to do in war theaters. And I'll now pass the mic.
Thank you so much. So being from Germany, I know what it's like to be the target or the main target of criticism stemming from the United States. At least this is something that we saw during the last administration. Why I think this is a huge concern, several reasons. First of all, we know, and this is where I agree with Maria, that the Trump administration is transactional. So it's going to be tit for that. If we cannot, equal our burden sharing, I think the criticism will be there. And there will also have to be concessions if we are not able to ramp up our own defense and security resources in this regard. And with the prominent role that Elon Musk certainly plays within the administration, I think this will be also, as Maria has mentioned, one of the battlefields. The space sector will be one of the battlefields, not just for concessions, but also for criticism. There has been reported, and this is something that Vice President J.D. Vance stated during the election campaign with regard to Musk and European attempts to regulate X and regulate content on social media, that if European efforts do not stop, this might be the basis for calling NATO Article 5 and solidarity into question. And I don't see any reason why this should not apply also to the space sector when it comes to limiting Elon Musk's scope in the space sector. And one of the main concerns I certainly do have when it comes to European dealings with the new Trump administration is that the Trump administration very well might be a power that rather than uniting us, drives us apart, especially when it comes to, or when our own security and defense is on the table. So I think the European unity that is needed also with regard to passing the EU space law is certainly at risk if concessions by individual states have to be made. And lastly, I think it's still is necessary for us in Europe to ramp up our capabilities also in the space realm, and certainly with regard to SSA, because one of the few things that is known that Donald Trump has said about the space sector is that he could very well think about limiting our access to information provided by satellite infrastructure. So this is something where we certainly will have to be aware of, although I have to admit during the last administration on the working level, transatlantic relations were worked very well, also with regard to space. But these three things, his transactionalism, Elon Musk, and impacting his ability to do business within Europe, and also the burden sharing potentially driving us apart. This is why I am wary of what is about to come.
Thank you very much for these answers. No questions. Madame? Please wait for the microphone.
Hello, hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I had a question more concerning what was mentioned from the German side about the possibility for the armed forces to take advantages of the services with very strict conditions, of course. I was wondering if such a situation was provided in the Italian space law, because I know that on the French side it was quite recently added.
So, yeah, so in a sense, it is and it isn't. The fragmentation that I mentioned for the Italian system doesn't really mirror the defense sector, in the sense that we do have a very clear structure of who takes care of what in defense matters in space. So that's the reason that I gave myself for there not being a clear provision for that in the space law. But I do see the fact that the Italian Space Agency has to authorize and supervise activities, and I do know that the Italian Space Agency also has regular talks with the military institutions regulating space matters. I do see that as a guarantee that will happen. But I also foresee some changes in that respect now in the approval of the law, and I do for sure hope that, especially coming from the defense and security programs, we for sure advised for some edits to be made in that sense. Even just a comma or two would be enough. But the fact that the Italian Space Agency has to say yes or no to certain activities, also depending on their urgency, clearly opens up to the military also being kind of like allowed to not call the shots, but advise at least on the shots.
Okay, I have a question as to the legitimacy of the EU to draft a space law when it is not even a party to the Outer Space Treaty and does not apply the rules and obligation of the Registry Convention. For example, you know that the Galileo satellites are not registered. So we have a very poor example here in front of us with the EU not abiding to the UN Convention. And I think as long as they continue to not apply the obligation of the UN Convention, their legitimacy to propose a space law is nil.
First, I can only agree with the criticism that, especially when it comes to registration, it's really important to share as much information about a launch space subject as possible, especially because we're putting so much emphasis on debris space traffic management, and the first step for space traffic management is to register your object. That said, the international space law framework and what the EU and national laws are doing at the moment are two different things. Of course, both on national and EU level, rights and obligations from the international space treaties have to be followed, but I believe they regulate two totally different things, especially because, as it was mentioned before, the EU space law is not going to go into these areas that are regulated by the international space treaties. I don't think it raises a matter of legitimacy as such. It's going to be, I suppose, two things in parallel. The international space law framework will exist anyway. It's reflected into many national space laws. And then whatever the EU space law is going to bring is not going to address those. If I could reverse maybe the question to what should the EU do to comply more with the international space law regime, that doesn't have to do with the effort to create an EU space law, but with the position of the EU in the international scene. And again, agreeing with your point, if the EU sees an EU approach to space, it would be a good idea as an organization, intergovernmental organization, if I say that properly. It cannot sign or ratify the treaties, but it can recognize rights and obligations. That would be a very good first step. Not necessarily, because if it doesn't, it will be a matter of legitimacy, governance, whatever down the line, but it is a way to ensure that there is not going to be any conflict in this regard. Maybe a recommendation, if possible, to move this way, but I don't see a direct connection with the EU space law.
Thank you very much. We are going to start the second panel of this event entitled Industry Views on the EU Space Law. And I have with me three presenters who will discuss the economic implications of the EU space law, especially on competitivity and other economic aspects. And first, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Emmanuel Bourdoncle, who's project manager on regulation and sustainability of space activities at the Directorate General for Enterprise in the French Ministry of Economics and Finance. Previously, at the Department of Legal Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he was in charge of space law issues, and he's now dealing in coordination with the French Space Agency and the ministries concerned with the development and evolution of the French regulatory framework for space activities and the European discussions on the future of the EU space law. He holds a PhD in international law from the University of Paris II and is the author of several academic publications. Mr. Bourdoncle, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone, and thanks again, Paul, for hosting us this morning and for this very interesting roundtable. I think it's a good opportunity to talk about this important initiative from the European Commission. I would just like to give some insight and thoughts about what are the French position on the European space law and how we see this initiative from the European Commission and what are our expectations on that future regulatory framework. Maybe to better understand how we see that text into the French administration, I would like starting by some historical reminder and talks about the birth of the European space law. The first time we discussed about a European space law, it was in 2020, I think, something like that, during the German presidency of the European Union in the second semester of 2020. And the first reaction in France at that time was to be a little bit reluctant regarding a future European space law because of the competency issues, the respective competency of states member and European Commission. And as you know, in France, we have an impressive French space law, specialized on the space traffic management and the safety rules, etc. And we saw that initiative as a concurrent one, and we were a little bit reluctant. After that, there is a lot of reflection in France, in Europe, a lot of discussion. And one important step was the communication in 2022, the European approach on STM, where all the states members and the European Commission agreed on a common view on what could be a European approach on space traffic management. And after that, last year, the European Commission starts the discussion with the states members on this European space law. And the French position has evolved, has a lot evolution between 2020 and now. Why? It's because the European space law now have different goals from the national law. And we talked about earlier a lot about the interaction between the national level and the European level. And I think it's a key point to understand how we conceive the link between the European level and the French level. What are we expecting from the European space law is directly linked to the goals of the European space law, and especially what we are talking now. It's about the industrial impact and the economic approach for European space industry. Why I say that? Because I think you all read the Draghi report, and I think the Draghi report made an honest and good analysis about the weakness of the European space industry, of the current weaknesses of the space industry. And many of these weaknesses could be solved through a European space law. Why I say that? It's because if I look the Draghi report, and I recommend everyone to look at the text, what kind of weaknesses has been identified by Mario Draghi in his report? The main difficulty is linked to the difficulty to funding European space industry, to the fragmentation of the market, and it's one of the main differences between the European space industry and the US space industry, for example. We have competency in Europe, we have private actor, we have a public funding, we have public interest for space activities, but in the same time, we have difficulty to fund, especially in the context of the new space activity. And as you know, we talk about SMEs, and we know this kind of activity claims for huge investment, capacity to take risk. And it's a difficulty in Europe. Why? Because of the fragmentation of the market, and everything is completely different. If you start an industry, if you developing products and services, if you are in an internal market of, for example, in France of 60, 70 million of inhabitants, or if you are in the European at the European level. So the first reason why we are supporting the US space law is directly into the first goal of the European space law, to create an internal market for space activities. We think this capacity to create an internal market will be key to support the funding of SMEs, and about more SMEs, but for the entire space industry. The second reason why it's quite important, it's to implement a level playing field. We know, and we can draw a comparison between space sector and other technological sectors. One of the difficulty we have in Europe, it's the fact that we are more open compared to our competitors. I think about the US, but also China or other countries. And the size of the European market is a very good leverage to help us to support the competitiveness of our space industry. That's why the capacity to the European space law to really implement a level playing field will be an essential tool, an essential mean to support the competitiveness of the European space industry. So I think, and I would like to conclude quite, I will conclude on that because I want to let the other speak and to have the opportunity, we have a discussion, but we see, finally, we see the European space law as complementary from compared to the national space law. National space law is in charge to implement international obligation, but the European space law are more dedicated to an economical approach. That's why the legal basis for the US space law are the internal market and not the Article 189 of the treaty. And what we expected is that the European Space Law is a necessary, not sufficient step, but it's a necessary step to protect the competitiveness of space industry. And we are frightened that without a European Space Law, the gap between the European space industry and the non-European space industry will be bigger and bigger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bourdoncle. So we have heard a lot of elements regarding competitiveness of the EU space industry. We also have heard elements about resilience, about security, about sustainability. So we have two representatives from industry today with us that may provide us maybe with the perspective of some industrial actors in Europe. It was mentioned that there were, this morning during the keynote, that there were a lot of proposals and a lot of reactions from industrial actors. But as things have evolved, maybe we can update and see some new perspectives today. And for this, I have Ms. Jocelyne Briec, who is General Counsel at Arianegroup. She manages the legal, compliance, DPO, customs, and export control teams of the company. Prior to the creation of Arianegroup, for which she supervised the legal aspect, Ms. Briec was head of legal of the Space Systems Division at Airbus Defence and Space. So, Ms. Briec, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your invitation and to have time to exchange. So I will adapt what I have prepared, because I think we received already quite answers, a lot of answers with respect to the EU draft law regulation. I can only concur to what has been said just before. Today, the European space sector is in a survival mode, I would say, because it's not only a matter of regulation, and I fully share that today we are lacking of an internal market with a European preference, because I think it is the key debate we have since now decades in Europe among member states. This debate is, I would say, frozen, for example, when we are discussing about the treaty for the Ariane exploitation. What means your preference? For some states, it means that they will, of course, go through using first the European launchers before going outside. For the other states, this is not at all the case. It should be the cheapest launch services available on the market. So it could be US, it could be others, it could be Russian, whatever, even if they, of course, support the European manufacturers. So it's a kind of schizophrenia we are currently facing. I think this is really the term we need to use. And now the situation, when we look at Russia, Ukrainian, and Trump, because you spoke about Trump and the US, in fact, we are quite like little children in the middle of where we now to grow up very quickly and to take strong decision. If we don't, and you spoke previously about a bargain, we will enter into this bargain. And as you said, we will face not a unified, I believe, European position. And it's what we could fear for our future as an industry. We are not today in a very good shape, because indeed access to space is at the end a matter of sovereignty, because we need, I think, really that as European citizens, but actors as well, we need to have an independent access to space. It is key for our defense, but as well for our market and for our citizens, because if we have not this, today you all know that all applications of your smartphones are coming from space. So, and even your own car, when you look and you use a GPS. So it's really, I think, a wake-up call, a very urgent topic we have now. We have no choice, and we need to go very quickly through this unified European market. For me, I think I pledged for that. We should not be afraid about a new law. When I heard about the German reaction with respect to German space law, I can tell you I was invited at that time, it was almost 20 years ago, for the setting up of the French regulation, space regulation, and we had exactly the same fears. Very demanding regulation, and especially in terms of space debris, for example, because I think that French one was very severe and is still very severe. But when you look back today, we have eco-designed the Ariane 6 launcher. And I think this wouldn't have happened if we didn't have this strengthened and very forced commitment from the French regulation. If we have not ambitions in terms of law, okay, we will do whatever we could, but it will not be the best. But what it is key is that we are, in a way, for industry, supported to go this way. And so we need, for an ambition, we need a European ambition for defense, for an internal market, and as well for some important, as you said, for the LEO space today and the debris. It is really a very important issue. For this topic, I think if we've got an internal market that are preserved and that set for a European preference, I think the Commission could support transitory measures to enable all actors to compete at the same level with the same regulations. It's what happened in France, because at the end, when we had this space law regulation, I can tell you that we were unable to launch Ariane 5 any longer. Because when you look at a launch system, when it is conceived for 13 years. So you cannot change the launcher. Otherwise, you may face failures. And due to the cost of the satellite, the financing behind, you cannot afford to have a failure. It's not like in the US. In Europe today, a failure, you are dead. You don't exist any longer on the market because there is not enough public funding and there is no really available private funding. And when you compare the public funding today compared to the US one, you see totally where we are. And it's why we are as well in so difficult shape today. So, but I think thanks to the dialogue, because it was like you presented, a lot of dialogue between industry, French state, regulators, and so on. At the end, transitory measures were adopted during a certain time, enabling industry to grow up in the standards that were imposed by law. Because of course, if you don't launch anymore due to a regulation, it is as well a no sense. So I think we are all clever, and by this experience, I can as well testimony that sometimes and many often the dialogue results in positive things. So for me, indeed, I really ask for a European preference because it is our common future to have access to space in an independent manner. And I think it's all of us, our duties to work on this, to have at the end European capacities to go to space whenever we need to. This is what I would like at least to share with all of you.
Thank you very much. And I just want to take this this opportunity as a chair to ask a brief question. You talked about opportunities of the EU space law. Do you see, however, as was mentioned during the first panel, some challenges, or do you have any concerns about the potential content of the law in terms of competitiveness and in terms of if it could be that some elements could be detrimental to competitiveness?
I don't know if we could say, because we have no law, so it's difficult to speak about it, as mentioned before, so I will answer the same. But what I can tell you is that indeed it shall not overcost, and it's why I'm speaking about measures to accompany the companies, because we are all survivors in these space sectors for the moment. In Europe, at least, we are not at all in good shapes. So now we have 2 launchers in Europe now giving back access to space. But it's true that in any case, if we have additional, because we need ambitions, but if we have ambitions, you need to think about how to support industries to be able to meet these new standards. It cannot be a black and white. It is both ways. If we want to win and to go to ambitious purposes, which we need, indeed, even for industry, because it's a manner to get into, I would say, competencies. But today, competition is there. And even in the European market, we are facing US companies, Russian companies, no longer Russian, but before it was Russian, but outsiders. And competition is good, but when you have the same ways and when they are fair treatment. Today, I don't think that when you look at SpaceX, for example, they have the same concern about space debris. When you look at Ariane 6 today, I can tell you that people, and we have an eco-design teams, and they have thought about debris. And all the upper part of the launchers was conceived to avoid debris for 90% of the missions. So it is, and this has been done against the launcher performance. So we could go higher if we wanted to, or take more passengers, but to avoid debris for the upper part, we have reduced our launch performance. So this is a choice, but it's part as well of European, I would say, standards and as well concerns. But yes, today it's a worldwide competition. It's very severe. And this European law, in a way, it's Europe against the others. And I think you know about it because you mentioned the fact that you will enter into bargainings with some big powers of space. And this will happen. So we need unity and we need to be one and to secure that our ambitions, political ambitions, are as well for the benefit of industry and for the citizens, because industry in Europe, at the end, it's the citizenship, and the citizens, we are all working for this sector.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your intervention. And now we'll yield the floor to Chehineze Bouafia, who is the head for regulatory affairs on space and telecommunications at Eutelsat Group. She's also in charge of matters related to space law and policy, in particular compliance with the French space law. And she leads Eutelsat's group's reflection on political and legal developments to address new developments such as constellation, space traffic management, in-orbit services, etc. Chehineze previously worked at the Institute of Space Law and Telecommunication as a research and project coordinator. Thank you very much. Ms. Bouafia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Paul and Ifri for the kind invitation. I'm very thrilled to be present here today on a panel with such high-level colleagues and estimated colleagues as well. Maybe briefly, I'm pretty confident that most of you here know Eutelsat Group, but just in case, I have a trainee today with me, so I'm pretty sure he doesn't know exactly about Eutelsat Group, so I'll give 2 minutes a round of introduction. Eutelsat Group is the result of a combination between Eutelsat, a historical operator, operating a fleet of 36 geosatellites, as well as the OneWeb UK-based constellation, which is a constellation of 634 satellites. The result of this is Eutelsat Group, a leader in connectivity and multi-orbit connectivity. We are very familiar with stringent regulatory framework in a sense that Eutelsat Group, as part of its long-standing experience has been subject to the French space law, which is one of the most stringent, exhaustive framework applicable to space activities. But I like to say that Eutelsat Group did not wait for the French space law to be promulgated, to be a responsible actor. Already back in 2005, we had implemented a space debris mitigation plan in accordance with international guidelines and also as part of our experience, best practices experience, which allowed us, when the space law, French space law, was promulgated, to already be in line with the requirements of the French space law. We're also subject to another European, not in the sense of EU, but European framework, which is the UK framework. So our LEO constellation is subject to the UK framework, which is composed of two primary acts of legislation. I will not go into the details. I don't want to bother you, but those are two very comprehensive framework. And now, as part of the merger of the company, we're trying to work on further alignment as well. So harmonization is something we experience at the core of our activities these days. That being said, I would love to be able to say that all actors behave responsibly in space, but spoiler alert, it's not the case. And one of the reasons, I'm not saying it's the only reason, but one of the reasons being that the regulatory landscape is fragmented, meaning that some countries do not have a space law at all, and other countries do have a mere framework with not sufficiently stringent requirements when it comes to space debris, and some frameworks, frankly speaking, don't even address the question of space debris in itself. So that's one of the reasons why we observe a fragmentation in the best practices of operators as well. So in that sense, I think we could, justify and explain why an EU space law is needed. The thing is being that within EU space law, the level of action is only regional. So what we could expect from an EU space law is, once it is there and in place, to then be promoted at international level. But before even entering into that, I think what we need to address, and very practically speaking, and again, it's a very difficult exercise, because without a space law to look at and to study, it's difficult to just assume, but let's assume together. I believe that there are a number of existing frameworks that could serve as a model to the EU space law. Of course, I named the French space law. The UK framework is one of them, but there are other frameworks across the globe that the EU space law could get inspired with. One aspect, I think, that is key for us, and I don't want to, I will, continue with the discussion, but I don't want to take too much of time here. I think competitiveness is most likely the area of concern for us. I don't want to go back into what has been discussed this morning. I think the panel of ladies explained it very well, the various challenges and opportunities that this EU space law has to and can offer. So I will try to focus on maybe the area that might be of concern for us as a satellite operator, a European satellite operator, which is definitely competitiveness. I think one thing that needs to be acknowledged is that regulatory constraints do have a cost for operators. And we can perhaps go into further details of what those costs are without giving out too much. But that being said, it needs to be acknowledged. Obviously, another area of concern would be innovative technologies and the way they will be addressed in the EU space law. I'm thinking about ADR or in-orbit servicing, but I'm also thinking
of other areas such as dark and quiet skies, which was mentioned earlier by Dimitra. Of course, those areas are still novel, and I would be very vigilant as an operator as to how they will be addressed in the context of an EU space law. And for that, I'm very happy that I understood that there is a binding part of the EU space law and a non-binding one. So hopefully those areas will be part of the non-binding part, which could be then subject to room of improvement or ways to incentivize the industry to do better on these areas without necessarily for them to be binding in the first place. And so it comes back to the comment of Jocelyne earlier on transitory measures. I think in our experience as a French satellite operator, the transitory measures that were part of the French space law were very, very helpful to kind of address those requirements in a more peaceful manner. And so those are just examples on how to ensure a smooth transition from a non-EU space law world to a new EU space law world. And then maybe one last short comment on my side. I would love to see startup and SMEs also give their voice on what they consider to be their areas of challenges. But I think maybe as part of the discussion here, it's something we can tackle and address. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your intervention. You have been very efficient, all of you. We are going to have a very long and interesting discussion. I will open the floor to questions. You may want to direct in a priority your questions to Ms. Briec, who unfortunately will have to leave a bit earlier. So I encourage you to direct your questions first and foremost to Ms. Briec.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Now everybody can hear me. My question would go to Ms. Briec, but also to Ms. Bouafia regarding the transitory measures. Because that is also a concern from a German industry point of view. And since you have experience with the French adaptation of a space law, perhaps this might give us some best practices. What could the government also do in this regard?
So it was for us as launcher, but I think we had the same concern with Eutelsat, and I think the satellite manufacturers as well. In fact, we were not able to launch because the technical regulations enabling and authorizing a flight from the French territory was so demanding that in fact we were not able to modify the launcher because they are designed, at a certain time. So the beginning of the design is very crucial because afterwards you cannot change very much only on marginal topics, the launcher, and you need to exploit it for 20 years. The cycle of a launcher development is very long, and the recurring costs, the investment to amortize this investment are very long as well. And so we had at that time dialogue with the administration. So it was the technical part and the ministry, so CNES and the National Space Agency and the Ministry of Research. And they have authorized us to be in derogation during a transitory period of time with respect to some technical requirements of the space law. And so indeed, it lasted during many years up to the time where we were able, technically speaking and financially speaking, to modify the launchers. And when we conceived Ariane 6, because for us, the time frame is not the same than satellite, even if a satellite is a quite long duration as well. For Ariane 6, we take on board all the required all the requirements of the law in terms of debris, because in France, the law is very demanding on this aspect, and as well with respect to damage to persons, goods, and environment. And we took it all on board, and we have made design choices to comply with the regulations. And so it enables us as well to think about, during this period of time, how to modify the launchers, what could be the advantages. And as you said, in terms of competition, for us, it is a plus to be able to demonstrate that our launcher have been eco-designed. So thinking about what will be the impact on the biodiversity, on everything, and on the debris. And it's the transitory period was very, in a way, efficient, because it enables us to continue working, to know where we had difficulties to comply with the laws, and to modify, to take them into account on a regular basis. And I think it was very good accompaniment measures to enable us to comply with laws. So each time for a launch, we had a kind of derogation with respect to compliance of the law.
And maybe to complete on that, I can only echo what Jocelyne just said, as it also applies for operators. One element maybe that I would like to emphasize is dialogue. I think Jocelyne mentioned dialogue, and if it is of utmost importance for operators, private industry, private sector as a whole, to be able to have an open, transparent dialogue with public authorities, with public institutions. And it comes back to the fact that the voice of industry needs to be heard and needs to be included as part of the decision-making process, but also as part of the overall conversation around this EU space law. The reason being, you want to have measures and requirements that are actually implementable, if that's even a word, and that actually are pragmatic and can be taken on board by operators. Because we sometimes see a lot of suggestions as to how operators should run their operations, but sometimes I must say that realistically speaking, this is not something that can be done or achieved. So I think it's really, really important for public institutions and national authorities as well to make sure that the voice of industries is being heard. I think it's also for the sake of the law in itself.
If I can add one thing, it's true that for the French actors, as you said, the dialogue was very important. I remember that time, and we had during a year regular meetings with the authorities by sector. So there was a space operator on one side, the satellite manufacturers on the other side, and the launchers on the other three pillars of this regulation. And we had exchanges. It was not very nice at the beginning, I can tell you, because we were all afraid about this new regulation. And in terms of costs, because indeed it has a cost and we cannot avoid it. And you need to think about how to accompany really and to support industry during this period of time to be at the same level. It will not happen in 1 year. It will take very much time, long time. It's 10 years. We need to understand what is the time frame for space. It's not a decision that we take and tomorrow you apply it. This is impossible for this industry. So the time frame of developing a launcher, of bringing up, setting up a financing for the space operators and so on, it's a long period of time. The costs are very heavy. So it's why we need, and I fully share this dialogue. At the same time, I'm thinking that now we have had the level with respect to the debris. For me, what is a concern is that I hope that the European law will not be less demanding, because to be now at this standard, and it's not only French entities, it's as well other European companies working on the Ariane or Vega launchers. We are at a certain standard today. And it has been financed, those launches have been financed by European states through ESA, the European space agencies. And my hope, personal hope, is that we will not decrease this level of requirements, because I think that at the end, it is an asset for industry to be able to justify that we are going to space, but we take care of the debris.
Are there other questions? Yes, Ms. Massarin.
Thanks. So this is more of a curiosity on my part for both our industry representatives here. As think tankers, or researchers, we love best practices. And I think what you said is a prime example of that. So I was wondering, so we talked about dialogue within French borders, but I was wondering how much of that dialogue, especially regarding best practices, also extends beyond national borders and goes within Europe, because thinking about the conversations I've had with industry, Italian industry, I mean, not many of these of course we have best practices, but not many of the ones you mentioned are incorporated. So I think it would be very beneficial to sit down or sit in front of a computer and have talks. So I was wondering whether that was happening, because I mean, there's lots of consortia in different constellations of industries. I wonder if that's happening, if the French system is leading by example, or if that's more of a hope for the future.
I can take that one. I think it definitely comes back to my point earlier on, being able to promote a certain model. So for sure, the French model is a virtuous one, so why not take it on board and into consideration? But then also as part of the European space law, I think it's very important for the EU institutions to be able to promote the European model once it's there. But then from an industry operator perspective, there is certainly room for improvement as to how we advocate for our own best practices. I think, to be fair, we already do that in many fora, many instances. I can give you two examples, one being the GSOA is the Global Satellite Operator Association, which Eutelsat is part of, and along with other fellow operator, we drafted a code of conduct of operators in which we kind of lay out some best practices that we consider to be important. And then we also identify areas where there is room for improvement, or where we need more research to be able to address those issues properly. So it's available online if you want to look it up. And then another document that I'm happy to advertise is kind of like a best practice guide of constellations. And this one we drafted with the Iridium SpaceX. And I hope I'm not forgetting anyone. And this one is also available and very much focused on best practices from a constellations perspective, and how best practices of operators that satellite operator established among themselves can actually already be taken on board by some of the frameworks and regulations. So in this specific guide, we actually mention and give example of how we coordinate when it comes to space traffic management, space traffic coordination also with other satellite operators. And those are very concrete measures that we took on board and that we are implementing on a day-to-day basis with other fellow constellations and other satellite operators. And so best practices established by the industry, taking stock of their own experience, operational experience, already exist. And I think those can definitely be taken on board also of future frameworks such as the EU space law, just because those best practices are actually pragmatic, already in place, and suit the reality of daily operations. So yeah.
for industry is more difficult. And so, in fact, we comply with the requirements of technical regulations. Of course, I think engineers are sharing these concerns, but we have the dialogue is directly with the French authorities today. And especially because the launcher Ariane 6 is launched from Kourou. So it's difficult to share a knowledge or a regulation when you have a but we can compare with today because we have space activities in other countries within Europe, and we can testimony that the regulation, especially in terms of safety or environmental law, are quite either not so detailed than compared to French one, and sometimes they are more US standards used as a reference because of lack of technical referential. So it's difficult for European citizens to say, okay, we use US standards for launching activities on its own territory. I think if Europe could do something, it would be at least to avoid this type of standardization. And you know that, and I think this is really your concern, is to have standards that are European. And I think it's very key.
Maybe Mr. Bourdoncle, to add on the French system.
Yes, from the ministry point of view, I want to say I'm very pleased about what I hear about my colleague from the industry, because it's really what we want to implement through the French space law. It's the idea we have a permanent dialogue between industry and the French authorities. And we mentioned the technical regulation of the French space law. We have updated last year, and how we update the technical regulation through a permanent dialogue with our operators. And we have I think 2 years processes to discuss between the engineers of the CNES, the industry, and we talk about what standard we are updating, what will be the level we are put into place. So it's really important for space law to put into place a capacity of a permanent dialogue before the adoption of the law. So that's we have when we update the French regulation, but also after. And it's something I want to insist on, is that the idea of an authorization process, when we ask to the operator to comply with some technical requirements, the idea and what we have in France is not to have a sort of a place and the operator come with their files and we say okay or not okay, and after you come back home. The idea is to have a dialogue for months on the operation the operator want to have, and to help them to reach the technical standards. So it's a permanent dialogue before and after the entry into force of the regulation. It's not the idea to be in capacity to say yes or no to a space operation. The idea is to have operators will be in capacity to reach high-level standards. And I want also say that about best practices, that in France, we support the idea that at international level, especially into the COPUOS, will be in capacity to listen the private operator. Today, COPUOS is only an interstate forum, and we support for many years in France the capacity that Eutelsat, Arianegroup, but also the foreign operators to be in capacity to intervene during this debate, and not only an intergovernmental forum.
Thank you very much. Is there, yes, Mr. Muñoz?
Thank you. Just to react quickly on the transitional measures, of course, we plan to have transitional measures. We plan as well to have supportive measures, so in order to support the transition. And as well regarding the level of the obligations under 114, we need to have a high level. So we cannot harmonize to have a low level. So this is as well the interest behind. But as well, we need to a bit curve or curtail a bit some expectations, because this is the first time that the EU will act in the field. As a result, it will not be the silver bullet. It will not address all the issues. Plus, as I mentioned several times, without touching, of course, the member state competence, which are very, of course, important for us, a very important point. So just to add this point. And perhaps just on the best practices, this is why we want to have as well the possibility to have labels in order to push for these best practices, and in order to take on board the best one and to make them, let's say, I will say, more applicable in a way, more visible through labels, which are controlled as well at the EU level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there another question or intervention? Because within this debate, let's say I'm taking my role as a chair now, we have heard, I think, a lot of elements. Basically, the idea that the industry in Europe at the moment, the space industry, is in survival mode, as was said by Ms. Briec, and that is reflected in the Draghi report. So that is quite a dire situation for the space industry in Europe at the moment. And we have heard that the EU space law plans to impose, as you said, high levels of obligation, which puts constraints and new costs on the work of the industry. And at the same time, it will open and harmonize a new unified market and internal market for space activities. So I'm just wondering now, my question, given these elements, would be how to make sure to make sure that the dynamic of the constraints versus the openness of markets and new markets ensures the future competitiveness of the EU space industry, and what is the method to ensure that there is an equilibrium or balance in that regard? If you want to.
Yes. First, I think we all agree that any regulation has a cost. It's obvious. You can put a regulation without a cost for people concerned by this regulation. So the question is not how avoid the cost, is how to be sure that the benefit will be bigger than the cost. When we say that, how we can move on? I think there is two main things from our point of view to be sure that the European space law will have benefits more than cost. First is what Rodolphe says earlier about the proportionality and the necessity that for SMEs it will be specific dedicated rules to help them and not to be treated as the same as the main European operators. So the first is proportionality. The second, it's the procedure and the governance of the European space law, and what will be a huge point of attention for French authorities about the European space law. It will be the fact that the procedure won't bring too many administrative burdens, and the capacity to articulate the national procedure we already have in some country and the new European procedure. The idea is for the private operator who are submitted today to the French law. Tomorrow they will be submitted to the European law and the French space law. And what we want is for them, it doesn't change anything in a way. They still will comply, still will need authorization request, and into this authorization request, there will be European requirement. There also will be some national requirements, but the idea is for them, it won't be a big change. So governance and proportionality will be the key to limit the cost and to achieve the goal of supporting the competitiveness of European space industry.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, we have a question there.
I have a question thank you for your presentation. I have a question from Mr. Bourdoncle. It's regarding the dialogue you mentioned between the industry and the public. And I was wondering about two subjects. When you said that industry needs to be more involved, maybe in the COPers debate during the conversations. How did it happen maybe before? And the dialogue between the industry and the ministry regarding the French space law in 2008. Thank you.
If I start by the second question, it will be a little bit difficult because I wasn't in the ministry in the previous French space law during the beginning of the law was discussed among 2000 and 2008, so during several years. I think the situation at that time was quite different because there were few operators, and most of the time they were linked to some public interest. So it was quite different. And when I make a comparison with the dialogue we had the 2 past years about the update of the technical regulation, we were in front of much numerous operators than 20 years ago. About the copiers, the fact is that it has been since the beginning an intergovernmental forum, and it's kind of difficult to involve private sector in this discussion because some of the states represented in copiers don't want to involve private sector into the discussion. The idea we have in France is not to put industry at the same level as the state, because we understand we are into the UN multilateral forum, so it's kind of a necessity to let the state decide. But we want to associate the private sector to the discussion. There is a lot of working group into the copiers who work on space resources, work on the long-term sustainability guidelines, working on dark and quiet skies. And we think that the private sector has interesting input to present for the discussion. And we cannot make clear decision without listening. It's not to say, okay, private sector, give us what we want, and we will be okay with that. It's not the idea. Just say, you are conducting, you are managing space operations, so we want to have your point of view. If we don't have that, we miss something.
Very well. Any other questions in the room? Miss Arnould, yes.
I would have a question to Monsieur Bourdoncle. Could you be slightly more specific about this question of governance and procedure? How can you achieve, together with with Brussels, that it will not be more complex for the enterprise, for the companies. And also, how do you see the enforcement, the control?
We talked about that not so long time ago. What is important into the governance aspects of the future European space law? I think it's the capacity, and I know it's the way the Commission sees things. So we have a good agreement at the starting point, at least, about the necessity to decentralize the process. It will be to the member states to conduct the authorization process. And I think it's very, really important, because it's a way that for the national private operator to keep having the same engineers and the same office in front of them. And it's what will be the most important. So the necessity to let the governance process into the hands of the states member. Of course, it will be necessary to unify the 27 process, but at the end, on that way, it will be to the member states to have the discussion with the European Space Agency, European Commission. So the European aspect of the process, the unifying of the process, will be between the member states and the European Commission, and won't be a bureaucratic extra burden to the operators to conduct a dialogue with their national authorities, and at the same time with the European authorities. They just talk with the national authorities, and after national authorities talk with the European Commission. I think it's the best way to be sure that this process won't bring some extra burden, extra administrative burdens.
Any other question? Maybe I have one myself. It's about the extraterritorial ambitions of the EU space law, and the idea of imposing on the foreign companies that have access to the EU internal market the same level of regulation that we would impose to European operators. Do you anticipate issues with, or maybe the question might also for Mr. Muñoz, who is still there with us, but do you anticipate issues, especially from US political actors that may resist such regulations imposed on their actors? And we think, of course, about SpaceX, who is actually at the moment has access to the EU space market, is the most important, one of the most important actors in the space connectivity, let's say.
Of course, we expect that the US, but I think other states will be very interested, and more than that, into the European space law. Also, some European member states certainly will advocate to stay in capacity to use non-European solutions. And I think it's maybe it's new debate when we talk into space actors and into the space sector. But the truth is that it has been the case for many of the last big European regulation, this capacity to use the access to the internal market as a leverage for non-European actors. And we see that, for example, on the market, digital market act, etc. So it's not something new from the, if we look at other things at the space sector. So it's really, really important for us that this regulation European space sector, but also non-European space sector, as long as they intervene into the European territory. If it's just a regulation for European space industry, it will be only a disadvantage for European space industry. The interest of this regulation is the scope and the capacity to, as I said, to implement a level playing field among European actors and non-European actors. So it will be the key point, the scope, and it's a good thing that you raise this point at the end of the discussion, because I think the main point and our main expectation will be about the scope of this legislation. The European space law can only be supported if it's the way to implement a level playing field between the European actors and non-European actors. If not, it just will be a new cost for the European industry and a new way to disadvantage the European industry compared to the non-European competitors.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you have any other questions in the room? Maybe online. I don't know if you have access to the questions online. Actually. So if not, then it was my pleasure. I think we've learned a lot. Of course, we don't have a lot more input on the actual content of the space law, which is very much expected. But I think all of these interventions and all of the presenters have given you let's say, a broader context and maybe a broader history on the expected impact of the future EU space law and the reasons why the European Union is let's say, advocating, is preparing this new step in European space history. I would like to thank all of the presenters that were here today, that spoke with us, and those who traveled from abroad for some of them. I would like to thank you also. Thank our two interns, Emma, who has left, and Yiturk, who helped organize and pass the microphone. And I would like to thank also all the teams at Ifri that made this event possible. I wish you a very good end of the day, and I hope to see you very soon for new conferences and new events here at Ifri. Thank you very much.